Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our third grazing cover crop webinar. So grazing cover crops is an exciting and growing practice among Ontario livestock and crop producers. So the purpose of these meetings is to show you the benefits and practicalities of grazing cover crops through the experience of producers who actually graze the cover crop and to provide some technical information from OMAFRA specialists. So this evening we will feature Mike Buis and OMAFRA's John Molenhuis. There will be a Q&A session at the end of each presentation. And so for those of you who have attended the past two sessions, you will know that there is, at the end of the formal meeting, at around approximately 8:05 p.m., both Mike and John will remain online for about 20 minutes. And there you are free to stay on and ask any additional questions you may have. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Cover Crop Grazing Committee for their work in organizing this event. So I want to thank especially Bethany Story from Beef Farmers of Ontario, Tom Lewis from Ontario Sheep Farmers, and my OMAFRA colleagues, Christine O'Reilly, Andrew Barry, and Jake Monroe. So I would like to give a big thank you to all of you for joining us for tonight's grazing cover crop webinar and for your attendance over the past two evenings. I'm just going to introduce Mike. So Mike Buis hails from a third generation farm south of Chatham, Ontario. Mike and his family operate a mixed farming operation with vegetable crops and field crops, as well as a herd of beef cows. All the beef raised and finished on the Beef Buis farm is sold through the Buis Beef Retail Store direct to customers from the farm, which Mike has operated since opening in 2009. So also in 2009, Buis Beef were awarded the Agri-Food Innovation Excellence Regional Award. Mike is an active member of the Chatham Ken Cattlemen's Association and a former president of Beef Farmers of Ontario. So tonight, Mike is going to speak on the cost and financial benefits of grazing cover crops. So before Mike gives his official presentation, we do have a short video introduction to Mike's cover crop grazing practice that I'm now going to share and play for you.
I'm Mike Buis, and right now we're on the Buis Beef Ranch. Behind me you'll see some of our fall calves. We run about 275 spring calving cows and about 75 fall calving cows. Right now we're in a field that was soybeans, and we're grazing that, letting these cows calve out on this, and it's seeded with a cover crop. So we've harvested the soybeans off of here. We've baled the straw off for bedding, and we went over top with a fertilizer spreader and spun some rye seed on here, and that's what these cows will be basically living on. Early in the spring, we'll get good growth, and they'll be quite content to be out here right on through until we have to plant crops. Here's an example of some cereal rye that we planted, and actually what we did is we harvested the soybeans from this and baled the straw off, and then we broadcast just with a fertilizer spreader over top. So this is about 90 pounds to the acre of cereal rye seed, just broadcast on top, and there's enough residue and stuff left that this seed will grow really well, and it will get established this fall. It'll actually overwinter, and next spring this rye will grow really well and will be great grazing for the cattle on here in the spring. So this cereal rye in the spring will start to grow really quickly, especially if we get a kind of a warm, wet spring. We've added no fertilizer at all to this. The only fertilizer will be the cow patties you see dropped in here by the cows overwintering. In the spring, this rye with a bit of heat will actually grow so fast that there's times when 75 cows on 50 acres is not enough to keep ahead of it. So we'll let them graze that as long as we can until we're ready to start planting. When we're ready to start planting, we literally pull the cows off. We'll plant, if we're planting soybeans in here, we'll no-till soybeans in. If we're planting corn in here, we'll till it a wee bit, put our fertilizer down, plant our corn, pull the cows off, and terminate the rye with Roundup. And that system's worked really, really well for us. So the field we're in right now, this was winter wheat. We harvested the wheat, baled the straw off, then we no-tilled sorghum into it. So you can kind of see a wee bit of the sorghum that's left there. We baled the sorghum off and wrapped it. Our yield on that was about 5 bales to the acre, so 4 by 5 bales, about 5 bales to the acre. We harvested off of that. After that was harvested, we took the fertilizer spreader with our cereal rye. We spread about 2 bushels to the acre on top of that, and this will be part of our spring calving area. So we're not gonna graze this at all this fall. We're gonna hold this piece so that it's clean and ready to go for spring. So we'll let whatever comes up in the spring get a little bit of a head start, and then we'll put the cows out on here, and it makes an excellent spot to graze. As we get into spring planting, we need to decide what crops are going where, and we may have to fence some of it off if we want to get early corn in or whatever, just so we leave those cows out in the field as long as possible. The longer we have them out on these clean calving areas, the better. It just makes the calving system work so much better. Right beside me is corn. We're harvesting that today. When that's harvested, we'll take the fertilizer spreader again, spin some cereal rye out on top of it, and that will be a great spot to spring calve. There's lots of feed value left in those corn stalks for the spring, and we'll be able to get along quite well calving on these 2 fields in the spring. These green strips you see here, that's where we drop the windrow from the wheat straw. As we baled the wheat straw, of course there's some volunteer wheat that's come up, and we'll graze. That's not a problem. We'll graze right through that. When the cows get here, they'll be glad to have something a little bit different. Right beside that, you kind of see where the sorghum and the rye is, the sorghum stubble is, and where the rye started growing right here. And then as we move across the field, you see the corn stubble. So we're actually harvesting that right now. This corn stubble, although it looks like it's a wasted product, that it's something that's just going to go to waste, we can graze this really well with dry cows. Our basic rule is 1 acre corn stalks will provide enough feed for 1 cow for 30 days. If we add a cover crop to the bottom, so our plan is to seed some rye seed into this and let that grow. If we get that cover crop in there, that'll gain us an extra 2 weeks of grazing. So all of a sudden 1 acre does 1 cow for 6 weeks. So that's a tremendous amount of feed, and it's free. It's right here, it's available. It didn't cost us anything to put it there. Our only expense is the cost of the rye seed and a little bit of time to spread it. So in this field here, my neighbor planted some cover crop when he did his last cultivation. So he has a spinner on the front of his tractor, and he's planted some alfalfa. There's some turnips in here, radishes. There's some ryegrass. There's a whole host of different cover crops that he's planted in here. This seed and small plant stayed underneath the corn canopy until it was almost time for the corn to start ripening. Once the light started getting down in there, then these crops have a chance to get some light, and they start growing and produce some really good cover crops down in here. Of course, you'll have the odd little bit of corn that's left behind. You've got the corn fodder again to graze. So this will make an excellent field for cows to graze on this winter. This field, we're going to be, as soon as we get a bit of frost, probably mid-December, we will put these cows out on here, and they will graze on this for the winter. This will be their spot. So the field that we're in right now is actually my neighbor's field. And a number of years ago, we came up with an agreement between the 2 of us that I would graze the cows. I would do all the fencing. So in return, he plants a cover crop into his cornfield or into this wheat stubble. We let the cows graze the wheat stubble. I bring back manure. It's a great arrangement between the 2 of us. The reason this works so well is he's exactly right beside me. So we share a fence row, which makes it easy for moving livestock in and out, easy for looking after the livestock. The whole system just works great over here. You saw by the little video there, we took that just a little while ago. So those calves, fall calving cows out on that field is the nice sight this time of year, and that gives a great spot. What I want to share with everyone tonight is kind of my views on how we justify our cover crop grazing system, and want to think about it in terms of return on investment. So we're investing in seed and time, and we always need to justify why we do things and how we make things work. So we've been doing this program for about 15 years, and we'll graze on on about 700 acres that's cover crop, and we'll graze that for the winter, and then we'll turn around and crop that later on. You heard from my video, and you see here that we keep a few calves or cows around. This actual picture here is a few years old, but it shows you the potential of what we can get established here and put cows out on. So this is December 20th. There's a great amount of feed sitting in this field. So I want to share with you a little bit some of my views and how we get to this point. Here's another shot of some great grazing. So there's a lot of feed there. So we didn't just arrive at this overnight. It took a number of years and a number of trials and errors to get there. But as we try to put dollar values on things, the feed is easy because and I'll walk you through how we calculate our feed value. But if you look at this picture, you've got a whole host of things going on underground that is difficult to put a dollar value on, but there is real benefits to these to the roots and to the livestock underground too. So when we first started doing this, I wanted to say, okay, we're gonna put cows out on the field, we're gonna spend some money on seed. Let's figure out let's put some dollars to it. So you kind of see our grazing schedule. We put them out the 8th of January, took them out March the 20th, about 160 cows on it, working on about 145 acres in that piece. So here's the caveat in red, no extra feed added. And I got to be careful when I tell people I didn't feed my cows all winter, but we did not have to supplement feed in this group at all. So this is, when you start putting dollars at that, so 82 days worth of feed for that many cows, you can soon put a good number on that per acre. And so in my mind, here's what I have. I have roughly $100 an acre to put toward seed and fencing and care of the livestock. So the payback is definitely there most years. Now, not every year. We don't always have great winters or great cover crop starting, but most years we can justify really good results just in feed value. So the other thing we need to look at is we didn't have to harvest any of that feed. We didn't have to store it. We don't have to haul any manure either or put bedding in. The cows do all that themselves. So there's some real cost savings there. When you start to look at your organic matter, your erosion protection, I've got a couple of slides in a minute that I'll show you some huge things on environment. The roots that really help with soil structure, et cetera, and your water holding capacity. Those are some of the things that it's really difficult to put a dollar value on until you have a wreck, until you have a severe weather system. And I'll show you an example of what happened to me for that. So we talked a little bit in the video about grazing corn stalks and how much feed value we have in that just with the corn stalks. And we add a cover crop in underneath. That can gain us easily another 2 weeks worth of feed on every acre. Talked a little bit about wind erosion. So you see here, these are two pictures. These are actually along the 401. So you see where the fence is in the foreground there, and this is coming into the ditch. So my farm and one of my neighbor's farms, so the difference between a cover crop field and a moldboard plowed field. And you know, there's people that put a dollar value on every little bit of soil that leaves the farm, but you can see there that you don't need to do a lot of extra measurement to see that you're losing some really productive land blowing into the ditch. That's a huge loss for the field. Here's even more dramatic. So one that's worked and one that's not worked, right, with a cover crop, and how much of that soil is ending up in the ditch, and what's that cost to you? That's the best part of the soil. That's the the fertilizer and the nutrients on the top that are blowing away on you. The roots underneath, we talked a little bit about building structure and helping your soil alleviate compaction. And the whole system, when we're using the cover crop and we're grazing cattle, the system works so well that we just balance everything back the way nature intended it, and it makes our cattle grazing work really well, but it also makes our crop production system work really, really well. So we're getting the benefits of both worlds, both in a grazing and in a cropping system, all in one field, and it's working out quite nicely. When you can pull out a plant and you see that kind of root growth in the bottom, that's huge, because it didn't really cost us a lot of dollars to get that. That's just nature taking over and collecting the extra nutrients that are there. So we don't add any commercial fertilizer to our cover crops. This is all, it's scavenging whatever nutrients are there and making use of that, holding those nutrients until the next cropping year, and then those nutrients are available for our crops. They're not gone down the drains and or blown away in the wind. I'll show you this slide because you always have to have a whoops or a problem. So here we were seeding cover crop into standing sweet corn, and or actually this was seed corn, into standing seed corn, and I just, quite frankly, I didn't count the rows right. So you see on the one side of the screen, there's blank dirt there that didn't get a cover crop, and this part did. And of course, it's right by the highway, so your neighbors can see it, and they know that you can't count properly. But the story for this one comes the next spring. So the next spring, we no-tilled soybeans into this. So here's a soil sample of it, and you can see the various root growth down into the bottom. And as we get even to the bottom of the sampler, you see I even nipped off a worm there. So you can see how much good that cover crop's done just in 1 year on that ground, loosening it up and putting those root hairs way down there. So I'll show you this slide here. So we no-tilled into that, we burned it off, and shortly after we planted, we got a heavy pounding rain. So and I know, I apologize, it's a little bit tough to see. Where the yellow arrows are, that's showing where the bean rows are. And if you look here where the red arrows are, that's where the beans should be. So you see how that little bit of cover crop by the yellow arrow in the center has helped the beans survive, and where there was no cover crop, the pounding rain sealed that ground off and the beans did not survive. So the moral of the story is my neighbors had exactly the same weather I did. The only place I had to replant was, if you go back to this slide, the only place I had to replant was where I had miscounted and had bare ground. The rest of it was, I did not have to replant. So how do you put a dollar value on, when you get a severe weather like that and you don't have to replant hundreds and hundreds of acres, that really helps your bottom line in the cropping system. We talked a little bit about dropping it into various crops. And I guess when I do my analysis and try to figure out what my costs are going in, I've got a number of different ways that I can get my cover crop established. So I need to keep in mind what my timing of the year is, how much time do I have growth before it's going to freeze, what crops are we going into, and I can get away with really simple, just a fertilizer spreader, spreading it on top. We've no-tilled in. You've got fuel, you've got time, you've got wear and tear on your machinery, costs a bit more. We've got really fancy with a helicopter planting into standing commercial corn. That's worked really well. There is a cost associated, but that's given us that window to get cover crop established into commercial corn. It's going to be harvested late. We don't have that window for growth, and that helps us in those situations. So every different situation, we've got some options of things we can do to make this system work. I talked a little bit about the sorghum, so I want to in the video, so I want to just touch briefly on that. So the sorghum, very simply, we bale the straw off, we no-till into the stubble. This is 7 weeks after planting. So you're right up to the tops of the tires. So this is on one of my fields. So it didn't have no commercial fertilizer at all, just some manure applied. This year we had some on a neighbor's field that didn't get manure, and it was significantly shorter, probably about a foot shorter, and really yellow. So you could see that the sorghum was gaining some nitrogen from that manure that we applied, and that was really helping our harvest. So I think going forward next year on my neighbor's field, or if I have a field that I'm not going to put manure on, I may add just a wee bit of nitrogen just to give it an extra shot. But this is 7 weeks, this field, with no fertilizer and that much growth. So you start to put some numbers to that. We're about $1.10 a pound at about 15 to 20 pounds an acre. We're getting 5 to 6 bales an acre. In this particular field, we got 6 bales, and we'd only seeded 15 pounds. So the bales, by the time we got them into the feed bunk, were about $14 a bale. This is after a crop of wheat. So we've already harvested, we've already got our cash crop off of there, and now we're getting the bonus of this extra feed on top of it. The part that's hard to justify or hard to put numbers on is the root growth on the bottom. And you can see by this slide, that's just really, really significant roots in the bottom under that soil. And that's helping to loosen it and will help hold water and help us get through those severe weather events down the road as we need to. You look at this slide, and of course, this is another one that's right by the highway, so all my neighbors can see this really well. And you look at that from the road and you think, oh, this is this is a terrible mess, and he's destroyed the ground with his cattle. But when you look closely after it's dried off, you see that the roots, the crops that are left on top, the residue has really protected that soil. And you know what? We didn't damage it at all. It looked tough, but really we didn't damage it at all. Wanted to touch just a wee bit on my neighbors here. So in the front of the screen, here's the cattle just going over into my neighbor's field. We started that a number of years ago. I guess it first started out that the cows were getting in there on their own, which we had to have a discussion how we're going to handle that. So we had the discussion and said, well, you know what, the cows are getting here anyway. Why don't I just put electric wire around the outside and we work out a deal? So we did the calculation on how much manure one cow over the winter would actually produce and drop in there, and how much benefit the cover crops were going to do. He didn't have to go in with a stalk chopper and chop his stalks. He didn't have to go through in his wheat field to chop down weeds after they grew. A lot of different benefits that we started adding up, and at the end of the day, we said, you know what, I think we're even, and no money needs to change hands because this is mutually beneficial to both of us. The huge advantage I have is that it's right next door, and we can share a fence row, so I can easily move cattle in and out as I need to. So we'll graze his during the winter when it's frozen, and then I'll put them back on my side in the springtime to calve. They're just a little easier to monitor, etc. over there. So at the end of the day, we want to ensure that our practices are good, demonstrate good stewardship, both to the land and the animals, and provide sustainable farm for future generations. So I'll leave it at that and open it up to questions at this point.
Thank you, Mike.
My email's there, so feel free, if you don't get a chance to answer your question now, feel free to email me, and I'll be glad to answer anything that we haven't touched on.
So thank you, Mike. And as I say, Mike, we'll take a few questions now here with Mike, and I'll ask Christine to read out some of the questions. As I say, there will be further opportunity at the end of the meeting. Mike and John will be staying around after the meeting is finished for about 20 minutes or so. So if you have a question and it doesn't get answered in the first part of our Q&A, please stay on and we will try and get to your question at the end of the meeting. Okay, so I'll hand it over to Christine.
All right, thanks, James. So we've had some questions coming in to the chat during your talk, Mike, but of course, people, if you think of something while we're discussing, throw it in the chat. I'll see it and we'll we'll try to get as many of them answered as possible tonight. So first question for you, Mike, is potential yield impact on the crop following grazing. It's a concern from some crop producers. Have you noticed an impact either way, positive or negative, on the yields after grazing happens during the fall and winter before a crop?
Well, I guess it's the way that I look at it is this is a system we've done for a number of years. So if you would take cattle and put them out on, say, a field that's traditionally moldboard plowed, that hasn't had a lot of cover crops, doesn't have good structure, and doesn't have cover on top, you may do some damage. The thing is with a cow's hoof, the way that it's shaped, it doesn't compact like a horse. It doesn't pack. It actually, the toes actually cut in. So it's actually not compacting. We'll do more damage if we take a round bale out on a tractor out into the field. We'll do more damage with that tractor than the cows ever will. And we've actually measured compaction. Ann Verholland has come out and we've measured compaction on various areas of the field, and cows will follow a trail like they do with the pasture. So they'll follow a set trail. We've actually tested those trails, and those trails are less compacted than where the tractors go.
Wow.
So we've really not done any damage on the ground at all. There's far more benefits to the manure being dropped, the urine being dropped. The plants seem to, when a cow grazes a plant, it seems like it pulls it a little bit, and for whatever reason, that stimulates more root growth, and so you're making that plant grow even better. So we're seeing, the wheat we took off of that field of sorghum in, we were not quite 130 bushels, we were 129 bushels of wheat. The corn that we were harvesting that day, the monitor on the combine was showing 300 bushels in spots. So have we hurt it by grazing? I don't think so.
I don't think so either. For anyone on the call who doesn't know Mike farms down in Chatham, Kent. So he is getting a few more heat units than many of us, but those are still very impressive yields, Mike. When it comes to those cover crops, you mentioned that you broadcast the rye on after soybeans. Have you tried drilling it in, or why do you choose to broadcast?
So the reason I broadcast is because it's cheaper. If I have enough, if it looks like I have enough heat units coming, that the weather's good, I'm going to get a nice little rain, then I'll broadcast, because I can cover a lot of areas really quickly and really cheap with a fertilizer spreader. If I run my no-till drill, that gets expensive, wear and tear and iron. If I can avoid that, I will. So we try to go the cheapest way. The other thing that I didn't mention was my choice of cover crops. So we're talking about just something really simple like rye. And I've kind of gone down that road of we need to get 28 different kinds of cover crop planted. And I've come back with full circle. Let's keep it simple. Let's keep it something that's not going to be a weed to me later on. So we've had some issues with ryegrass that was supposed to be annual ryegrass that turns out to be perennial ryegrass, which is a problem. And a number of different things. So every cover crop kind of has its place, but I'm come back to let's keep it simple, let's keep it cheap. If I can get a cover crop in the ground for $20 an acre, then I'm quite happy with that number. Okay.
Now there's a pile of questions coming in about sorghum. Let's do this as a little bit of a rapid fire, because some of these could be like 3-word answers. So we'll do some rapid fire, and then there'll be a few more questions where you can elaborate and expand. So what was the seeding rate for the sorghum?
15 to 20 pounds.
What was the cost of the sorghum?
It's $1.10 a pound, so $1.10 times 20.
Okay. Did you make baleage with the sorghum?
Yes, we did. We cut it and wrapped it. We let it sit for 1 or 2 days, depending on the weather, and then wrapped it in plastic. It makes great feed. We use that out in the winter when to supplement some corn stalk areas or where we need a little extra feed.
How many cuts did you take off the sorghum?
So we just took 1 cut. We can do 2 cuts if we take it earlier. We don't have a lot of window, so we're battling that frost in September. So we want to make sure, you know, early October frost is when we usually see it. We want to kind of get it cut before that. If we get a frost on it, we'll get prussic acid coming up from the roots, and we run into some issues there. So then we have to wait a few days before we can harvest. This year we got caught with an early frost, so we ended up harvesting some before the frost and some after. It all makes great feed.
Okay. Was that a sorghum, like a forage sorghum, or was it a sorghum Sudan grass hybrid?
Sorghum Sudan grass
Sorghum
hybrid.
Sudan grass. Okay. What was the seeding depth on that sorghum Sudan?
So you want it to be about 1 inch, not very deep. Yes. And if you get a nice rain on it, that's perfect. And we just no-tilled it right into the wheat stubble.
It does need water to germinate, but once it's going, it's more drought tolerant than corn.
Right. It's very drought tolerant. So the hotter and drier it is, the better it grows.
Okay. Are you concerned at all about bloat when you're grazing cover crops?
We've never, touch wood, never had any issues at all. And we've grazed straight alfalfa. We've grazed radishes, turnips, all that kind of stuff. And we've never had any issues. We hold off grazing the straight alfalfa until it's frozen, and that seems to help. If it's mixed in with, if it's alfalfa that's in the bottom of a commercial corn stubble, then they get a mixture of both, and that seems to mitigate any issues. It will walk up and down the rows and find every last ear of corn that you put there. So we're really conscious that if our custom combiner has a whoops that he's spilled, that we know about it and make sure that we get that shoveled up so that we don't have cows with grain overload by finding that nice little pile of corn somewhere in the field.
Mm-hmm. And just with the alfalfa and the freezing, I just want to note that it takes a few days for that to become more bloat safe. So you don't want to have the frost and put them all out. You want to wait a little bit. We've got time for one more question now, and then we're going to take more questions from Mike after John's talk. So is there any reason why you're not interceding into standing corn at the 4 to 6 leaf stage?
So we tried that, and so my neighbor is doing that with his spinner at cultivation, and it works really good. We've tried the 4 to 6 leaf stage. With our commercial corn, we're finding too much shading, and we're losing it. If the place where that will really work well is in seed corn or sweet corn, where we don't have the heavy canopy, and then that small plants have a chance to survive. We were running into a few issues with some herbicide. We're still seeing a bit of residue and still seeing a bit of issues with some types of the cover crops. In that 4-leaf stage, the herbicide is still very active, and we were seeing some reduction in our stands. So we've gone back to the helicopter in late August, early September, and that seems to work pretty nice. And it's fairly cost effective too. We were doing, let's see, about $15 an acre for the helicopter to spin seed on. So that's not bad.
All right. Thanks, Mike. For those of you who we haven't got your questions yet, I apologize. I've made some notes. I'm watching the chat, but I'm going to hand it back over to James so that we can keep our evening running on schedule.
All right.
Thank you, Christine. And thank you to Mike. And so I know lots of you would like to hear a bit more from Mike. So just be aware that Mike is going to be staying on, and he will be available to chat after the formal meeting session is finished. And so some of those questions that you have that we didn't have a chance to get to at this particular point, we will get to those once we get to the end of our webinar tonight. So for now, I'd just like to introduce John Molenhuis. So John is OMAFRA's business analyst and cost of production specialist. John has led several benchmarking projects with Ontario dairy, beef and sheep producers, and has developed a benchmarking report using the Ontario Business Risk Management Program data. Before joining OMAFRA, John worked as in agricultural lending with the Nova Scotia Farm Loan Board. John has a Bachelor of Science degree in agricultural business from the University of Guelph and grew up on a farrow to finish hog operation outside of Strathroy, Ontario. Tonight, John will speak on getting the biggest bang from your dollar from your cover crop. So again, if you have any questions for John, please type into the chat box, and these will be read out during the Q&A session. So I will hand it over to John.
Okay, thanks, James. And just boot up my sharing the screen. And you're able to see that, James, and hear me fine?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Okay, very good. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. And good evening, everyone. And thanks for the opportunity to come and speak to you for a little bit here. And it's always kind of nice when, I didn't know exactly what Mike was talking about, but I don't say things that are in contradiction to him, which is always kind of nice because I know between the two of us, I know which one you're going to believe. So that's always kind of nice to have a little bit of, uh, you know, consistency on that side of things. So if you Google searched do cover crops pay, you're going to come up with a list, in 3.2 seconds. You're going to have a million hits of different studies that have been done on the topic, and you're going to be finding a list of some that say that it does pay and others that say it doesn't pay. And this the list that says it doesn't pay may be a little bit longer than the list that um, says it does pay. And some of the challenges around cover crops is it's that initial short-term cost and a long-term gain. So you're waiting a while for those long-term benefits to come, those things that Mike were talking about as far as the soil health and erosion control and those kind of things are coming in. It accrues over time. So it then becomes difficult with the short-term initial cost of the cover crops to have them pay for themselves. So it then becomes, as they say, a little discouraging in corn and soybeans, or a stumbling block to adoption and return on investment. And actually, the table that you see here comes from a presentation that I saw from Ridgetown College that was talking about some of the research they had done. And you see, the impact on profit, not great on grain and oil seeds, a little better on vegetables. So, the results are mixed on those side of things. But one of the things you do find that's consistent, if they've included a grazing as part of the study, that improves the economics. And that's part of that, then providing that short-term gain that's able to offset some of those short-term costs. So on when you include the grazing piece of that cover crop economics then becomes a little better, and that return on investment comes a little bit sooner, and then you still have those long-term benefits coming down the road. But there's actually, through the studies, there's several factors that are sort of coming into play and rising to the top as circumstances or situations or uh, situations in the field that contribute to paying your cover crops paying off faster. So it tends to be if there's some problems in the field or some situations that the cover crops can help address, then those short-term benefits come into play. So if you've got problem weeds as an example, and actually Mike last week Swiderski was talking about, the cash crop farmer that he was working with had some problem weeds. The grazing actually helped that, and some of those pieces and cover crops can actually help with weed suppression if you've got some problem weeds. And so you look at some of these factors that the unique situation, the typical in a typical year, in typical situations, the cover crops may not be paying, but in these other areas, if these situations are present on your field, those cover crops can make a bigger impact. And Mike was talking about some of the those weather events, like the extra yield in drought years. I saw some studies that showed, like, it was a multi-year study. The yield improvements were marginal, even if they were there. But then they hit 2012. If you remember 2012, that was that severe drought year, and they had 10%. It wasn't necessarily a yield bump. I think it was more yield protection. So it was protecting the yield, and they had the yield losses in the field that didn't have the cover crops in there, and those cover crops were able to protect that yield. So it's more almost like an insurance rather than helping out to get greater yields on that side of things. So, and things like fertilizer savings, if you've got cover crops that have legumes in there that give you nitrogen credits, those types of things. And then government incentives and grants. Yeah, free money is always good, and if it's available, those things can obviously help help set off. And like I said before, that grazing piece is one that is a factor that is becoming, helps to have that payoff quicker. And these are not exclusive to each other. Actually, grazing, I mentioned before, that can help with problem weeds. Grazing can help, with fertilizer savings as well, because of the manure. And Mike did a pretty good job of describing how they kind of did the math on that piece of it, of what manure might be contributing on that kind of thing. So these can stack on top of each other and just make those cover crops pay even faster. But we're here going to be talking about the grazing piece. So we'll talk a little bit, on the grazing cover crop side of things, whether it pays, or looking at an economic analysis on that side of things. The partial budget is a really effective tool, because grazing cover crops is really is a secondary piece to what the primary use of the land. The primary land use is the grain crops, the cash crops. And then this grazing piece is a secondary piece that, we just want to know what changes when we introduce cover crops, and what changes when we introduce grazing to cover crops, and just trying to see whether there's, obviously we want the benefits to exceed the costs, and just kind of doing a simple, what changes, not trying to do a full analysis with a whole farm budget, because then there's things that just don't change as a result of the grazing. Just want to concentrate on the aspects that do. So let's look at, and I've got some factors here, and there may be some more, and I'd love to hear in sort of discussion of some of the things that people are finding on this side of things. But just looking at grazing cover crops in particular here, the three main cost areas are obviously in the planting and termination, and those exist in cover crops regardless of whether there's grazing involved at all. So there's always going to have that planting and termination piece to it. And then the grazing has the grazing costs in there. But then there's also other potential costs in here. Some of the harvest complication, if you've got cover crops present, does that have an impact on, your harvestability? Is that going to impact the yield, or is it going to get mixed in and potentially have some grain quality issues, those types of things? And these things may or may not be part of it. It's just some things to think about. And there's that learning curve as well. Those whoops moments, right? Of, what are some of those things that happen that it's just a piece of a learning. And I've seen some other literature that suggests that showed actually that management over time was less because they became more comfortable with the system. And it was, so there's labor time, management time, less on that side of things, but there also may be yield benefits and that type of thing, because you're getting better with the system and getting the right crop mix and those kind of things. That kind of, again, it may not be factors for you, but it's something to think about on that side of things. And then if you're looking at, these are some of those things that we're talking, that Mike was alluding to as well. There's some that, these are, probably easier to calculate, because these are more on the short-term benefit side of things. These, feed costs, you can do those calculations, reducing tillage. If you're able to reduce some tillage using some of the cover crops, you can easily calculate those and the nitrogen benefits. Weed control, there could be some longer term advantages on the weed control as well, but there could be some herbicide, less need for herbicides if cover crops are controlling those, and certainly if the grazing controls those types of things as well. So those are sort of on the shorter term benefits, and those tend to be a little easier to calculate. But and the greater yields here, the jury's still out on those, whether it does cause greater yields down the road. And like I say, that it may not be so much a case of greater yields, but it's more sort of that yield protection in those like weather events, like the drought years and those kind of things, that it protects the yield and you don't get those dramatic yield losses in some of those weather events on that side of things. But then these are all those types of things that Mike was talking about that hard to put a number to. They're those longer term benefits that accrue over time. So they're longer term, so it's harder to put, to sort of think about the benefits in the short term. But they're also hard to put numbers on. But there's certainly factors that people are trying to put numbers to, and you see some of the research that have it. But certainly those benefits are harder to come by. And actually, if we look at, these in particular, the cost side of things, the costs are probably the easiest part of these types of things to calculate, because they're short term, and they're knowns as well. And that typically then leads to the question, I get the types of questions. So what is the cost of production for grazing cover crops, or for cover crops? And then, as a true economist, I give the very definitive answer of it depends. And, with cover crops, it really does depend. And we'll have to, I'll kind of walk through some of these areas of why it does depend. And some of these things Mike has talked about as well. Seed, you can go, very simple one species cereal, in the $10 to $25 range, or you can get into multi-seed mixes that are trying to do different things. And it does come down a little bit to some of the goals that you have as well. What are some of you, maybe it's just not grazing. Maybe there's some other soil goals that you're trying to address with some of the species that you're putting in there. But those are kind of the areas. And again, this is where, Mike says he likes to be in that $25 range. And I'm glad I'm kind of in those ranges in here. But then on the planting side of things, there's, it could be with another operation, like the one where it was the cultivator had, it was being broadcast with the cultivator. So if it's combined with another operation, it's not an added operation of the grazing the cover crops have to, then it may not be a direct cost to the cover crops. It's part of your regular cropping system. But then the broadcast, and then the no-till drill, just the differences in cost there. And Mike has already talked about those. And production insurance is another one you can consider. The new forage seeding, the establishment piece of cover crops can be covered by crop insurance. So maybe something to consider as well on for your crops, but it is available. And then the termination piece, right? You've got the cover crop, now you got to get rid of it. So it's either mechanically or spray. So you're either looking at, some spring tillage and cultivator or disking, or looking at the spray, if you're doing a Roundup burn down or something like that, you've got the application cost plus the product cost. Or again, I've seen it too, where it could be part of a typical practice. If you've got a pre-plant herbicide that can take care of the cover crop as well, and it's part of the regular cropping system, then that may be, it's not an added cost for the cover crop. Same in the mechanical, maybe a little bit of tillage in the spring is something you normally do ahead of the crop. So it doesn't, it's not an added cost. So there could be, zero cost attributed to the cover crop because it's just part of your regular crop rotation system. The grazing, well, the fencing and water, I mean, I think there's more variation on the fencing and water and on that side of things than there is on the seeding and the termination, just because this is getting down to infrastructure and where your land is and how your land is laid out and what kind of fences you need, whether you're beef or sheep. Beef may be able to get away with, single strand, where you need to go to multi-strand for sheep and net fencing. And so it's just a mix. And I know, harkening back to Christine's presentation in the first night of this, she was looking at fencing and water costs in the $60 range. I've seen ranges from $5 to $10 estimates right up to that $60 estimate. So again, it's a wide variation, but you take that investment cost, spread it over the life of the asset, spread it over the number of acres that you have, and add a little bit for the repairs and maintenance to come up with an estimate of what those costs are. And then of course there's the labor of the fence setup, or if you're moving livestock to a different location, those type of labor. And then when the livestock are there, moving them as you're moving them around the paddock, the labor that's involved. And again, it's dependent on where it is. If it's behind the house, then it might not take much labor at all. If it's down the road and you're working with some neighbors, then there might be some added labor on that side of things. So the last piece here, and I know there's a fair number of questions and interest on leasing arrangements or working with your neighbors on some of these things. So I just sort of put a list of some of the things to consider on for leasing arrangements and some of the things that, in answering these questions, it can help to sort of form an agreement with the neighbor. And I was pretty impressed when Mike was talking about, they actually did the math on calculating the manure costs and the benefits that are coming from the livestock. And so that in the end, they didn't have a monetary exchange between the two of them because they mutually benefit on that side of things. And we saw Jake in his results, income wasn't necessarily the driver for most of these. It was kind of on the soil benefits. And I think, if there's a cost recovery piece to this to offset that initial recovery, the initial costs of the cover crops, then that might be what the cash cropper is looking for. That would then give them a little more patience to wait for some of those long-term benefits. So if there's recovers some of the costs ahead of time. Liability insurance was one area that was talked about or wondered about. And typically it's the livestock owner that has the liability insurance, and the cash cropper can, as part of the agreement, say you need to provide proof that you have it, or at least give me assurances that if anything were to happen that you're covered. So it's typically the livestock owner that has those types of things. But then there's other things that you need to be looking at as well on the land side of things. But just, there are some good resources that you can be tapping into that talk about these factors and others that can help you. And the Greenlands Blue Waters actually has some pretty good templates, or at least forms, and it doesn't have to be long. Some of these are just 1 or 2 pages that, and it is always good if there's hesitancy on either side, having something on paper that kind of talks about who's responsible for what and what happens if things don't work out on those kind of things. So that's always a consideration as well, to have something on paper so you've got something to fall back on if things don't go quite as planned. So I'm only going to touch on the grazing benefits, and I know Mike did a good job on that side of things as well. But cover crops and forage value is a lot like pastures, in that the yields are tough to determine. So we end up a lot of times just doing the math backwards of figuring, well, they're out there, they're going to be eating, if they're happy and satisfied, then they're eating, they're meeting their dry matter intake amounts. And then you can take a couple of 2 different approaches here. Either hay at market value, and that's just saying, well, if I have to buy hay, then this is what it's going to cost me to replace what I'm getting off of the cover crops. Or the cost, again, these were coming out of some of the numbers that Christine presented on the first night. The hay per day costs for beef and sheep, $2.60 for the beef, and ewes at 44 cents. And then the grazing COPs from Christine, it was $2.26 for the beef and 38 cents for the ewes. So if you either use the market value or at cost value, you see the net benefit there of the beef cows. And of course, this is all contingent on the assumptions you make and the values you place on them. But this just kind of then at least demonstrates that there's some value coming back on the grazing side of things. And this is covering those costs, those seeding costs and planting costs and the grazing costs and the cost of production. So, you're seeing those benefits. So it does give you those benefits, in the short term, that allows you to be a little more patient for those long-term benefits. So I just did want to touch on, there is some cost share of money available through the Canadian Ag Partnership for cover crops. So if you haven't planted cover crops on the piece of property and you're looking to, then there may be some funding there to tap into. It is, targeted intakes, and it's merit-based, so it's not an open application process. So it is something to look into if there's interest on that side of things. It's up to a maximum of $8,000, 50% cost share on the cover crops. And then I'll just kind of end on this slide. Just again, this might be talking points when you're looking with different neighbors as well. If you can address some of these issues on some of the farms, that might be part of the selling piece on the grazing side of things. But these are some of these areas that can help make those cover crops pay off faster. And then the last piece here is just an infomercial on my part. We are doing a Canadian cow-calf cost of production network. So it's across the country. Canfax is leading it. It's a cow-calf, it's a cost of production benchmarking group that we're doing, and we're looking at having 4 different focus groups here in Ontario. We'd love to have some Ontario producers on the cow-calf side of things that would be interested in participating in this national network, and it's looking at trying to get some standardized benchmarking, and producers will receive individual farms will 500 honorarium, access to the KPIs, and then they will be doing some further benchmarking and some further networking and group networks that you can tap into on that group as well. So if you're interested in that, I would love to hear from you on that piece. So with that, I will finish up, and thank you, James.
Thank you, John. And so now I'll just call on Christine just to go through some of the questions that have come in.
Yeah. So John, the first question that I've got for you is, has there been any research studies looking at the costs and benefits of grazing a cover crop in Ontario conditions?
Not that I'm aware of. Like, I know the Ridgetown study was just on cover crops, so it wasn't adding the grazing piece to it, right? And I know there was some efforts to try to, like, I know there was one that was going to try to look at some of the grazing piece, but I'm not aware of anything. I don't know if you're aware of anything, Christine.
Not at this point, no. It's a question that I would love to see an answer to. Some of the research I've seen has been similar climate but different crop rotations, or similar crop rotations and different climate. So yeah,
like I know there was one effort there a while ago, but I don't believe it got funded. But I know there was trying to answer those questions because they wanted a little more Ontario specific numbers, right? But yeah, it didn't get funded, unfortunately. So I'm not aware of any Ontario data on that side.
Okay, thanks. Do you have any information on how much grazing a cover crop might save on yardage? So, and maybe explain what yardage is for our audience as well, in case they're not familiar with the term.
Yeah, yardage would be, sort of like a bit of the overhead costs involved in the operation, as far as like manure handling and having to have feed storage and that side of it, the yardage side of it, right? So I don't have any good numbers on that, unfortunately, but yeah, so that's sort of the piece that yardage would include. But yeah, I mean, with the manure handling's not there, and the the delivery, the hay, the harvesting and those kind of things, but haven't crunched the numbers on what that might look like.
Okay. And do you know, is there an easy way to calculate a fair value for my livestock neighbor to graze my cover crop?
Yeah, and again, like I think that like, I mean, for the livestock grazer, they're going to want to do some of that number crunching that I kind of showed there at the near the end there, as far as trying to figure out what their costs are and what kind of averages they could, or areas they could look at. Now I know per head per day is something that's typically used. Like I know in a lot of cases with the like on the cover crop side of things, it's sort of a sharing of the cost between the producer and the cash crop. Either the cash crop, they either split the costs, or the livestock owner pays for the cost. So maybe those types of arrangements can be put into place, as opposed to trying to come up with a fair market rate. Because I know, yeah, we get those kind of questions a fair bit on the cattle side as well, as far as what's a fair rate, or custom rate, or market rate on those kind of things, and we don't have good rates on that side of things. But yeah, you needed
would selling it as a standing forage be another option as an approach?
Oh, yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, I mean that's effectively what you're doing without the harvesting cost on your end, right? Mm-hmm. So that would be one approach that you're using. Yeah.
Okay, James is trying to keep us on time here, so I'm going to pass it back to him. But I think there will be opportunities to ask and answer more questions, so stay tuned, and I'll hand it back to James.
Thank you very much, Christine. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank John and to thank Mike for their presentations tonight. So this brings us to the end of the formal meeting session. And so as I mentioned earlier on, John and Mike will be staying on. So anybody who can stay on, we will try and get to some more of your questions that we didn't get to go along and answer in the earlier part of this session. And if you do have any other questions, feel free to put them into the chat room. I do want to take this opportunity to thank your participation. It's been extremely important to have you here, everybody on board for our for our 3 webinar sessions. So I do also want to go along and take this opportunity as well to give a big shout out to our earlier speakers. So to Kim Stisma in our first session, along with Christine, and to Mike Swiderski last week along with Jake Monroe. So again, excellent work was done by everybody involved. So again, I say thank you all for your participation. As I say, I will now ask Christine and Mike and John to put back on their videos, and we will answer some more of the questions that we didn't get to earlier on. So again, thank you to everybody who was able to come and listen to us tonight.
All right. Our first question is, will slides from the presentations be available to participants? Even better, Brian. We've been recording the webinar, so it will be up soon, sometime within a week, depending on my deadlines. But yes, we will get this up and available. Last week's is up on YouTube already. I tweeted out the link. Beef Farmers of Ontario and Ontario Sheep Farmers will also have those links, so feel free to ask your commodity organization for that as well if you don't happen to be on Twitter. But yes, there will be links available to a recording of this on YouTube, so you can come back and find stuff you missed or share it with a friend that you think would enjoy it. So yes, content will be available. All right, so we did have other questions that we didn't have time to get to. So I guess consider this the coffee and cookies part of the meeting. Unfortunately, I don't have the coffee pot on because it's hard to pass it through the screen. But yes, this is intended to be a bit more relaxed. So also, John and Mike, if you have questions for each other, fire away. One question that came in for you, Mike, was do you provide shelter or windbreak during calving? And have you ever had any issues with the perception that maybe the cows don't have enough shelter just from people driving by?
So I farm in a fishbowl. I'm right on 2 major highways. And we have, when we first started calving outdoors, we had the Humane Society visit us every single day from complaints. We've learned that when you have cattle out in the field, you put a round bale feeder with a bale of straw in there, and people say, oh, look, the cows have feed, everything's good. Out of all our cows, the only time they see a barn is if we have issues at calving that we need to bring it into the maternity pen. Other than that, the cows are outside 24/7 all year round. We do provide windbreaks, like our fields are seeded with cedar windbreaks on the sides for wind. If we don't have a windbreak in the proper side, we'll put a row of round bales, and that'll provide enough windbreak for the cows. Because our cows are out all the time, they get quite acclimatized, and they'll grow a good hide. And as long as we keep decent condition on them, we don't have any issues at all. We do provide, early in the spring, we'll provide some calving shelters so the little calves can get in out of the rain, and but that's the only shelter they'll ever see.
Okay, thanks. With your winter wheat, what timing do you typically harvest that grain?
So the winter wheat, and I guess I should mention that we fence the winter wheat off. We don't graze that. Our neighbor grows winter wheat as well, so we end up fencing off his field as well. just to keep the cows out of there. I think we probably can graze it. There's not a lot of feed value. We don't have a lot of top growth, and I am concerned about hurting the yield. So we do just keep them completely off the winter wheat. Normally we're harvesting that first, second week of July is when we're getting that off. What we have to remember when we're planting cover crops is it's kind of the opposite of the spring. When you're planting in the spring, you don't want to be too early, and you know you've got a certain window to get the crops in to get a yield. When you're planting cover crops, especially following wheat or following another crop, you have a diminishing timeline. So every hour you wait, you're losing potential yield and potential crop. So we've actually, when we're baling the soybean straw, for example, we're not even taking the time to pull the bales off the field. We're spreading seed around them. And the same with spreading manure. So we're actually planting cover crop and then putting manure on it so that we don't lose that week or two that we're spending spreading manure. We found that that's not hurting our stand at all, running the manure spreader over after it's planted. So we've gone to that.
Okay. This one I think could be for either James or Mike, but is any mineral supplementation required when grazing corn residue?
Yes.
Yes, is the short answer.
Yes. So we have a custom mineral package that we use that's made for us by Ken Powell, and they do a good job of providing everything that we need in our mineral package. We've gone to the point, because we have a number of employees, we actually have Mineral Monday. So every Monday, whoever's on chores or whoever's checking cows, make sure that the mineral feeders are full, and that way we don't ever run out of minerals. So it's free choice mineral all the time.
Okay. So James, what would typically be maybe lacking in corn residue that would be common to supplement?
Well, corn residue is quite a variable product. So in that case, then it is, it's a mixture of a lot of dead material and a lot of corn stalks. And it's it's an extremely variable material. So the mineral content of that is very difficult to go along to determine without actually having it analyzed. So the easiest way to go along and to deal with that then is to have a kind of standard mineral provided, and that pretty much will cover. The good thing about it is that beef cows, as a rule of thumb, are pretty tough animals, and therefore a standard mineral, it will be quite sufficient for them.
Right, and you'll also find that when the cows are grazing corn stalks, they'll start out with the ears of corn, and then they'll work on the tassel and the fine leaves at the top. And then toward the end of the grazing time, then they're working on those tough stalks at the bottom, which is very little feed value. So
Yeah.
if we need to supplement with additional feed, that time of year we need to do it. Also in January, if it's really cold, we'll add a bit of energy to it. We're supplementing with carrots a lot of times. So, but that's just because of where we are.
Yeah, you're in a unique position for carrot access.
Yeah, one of the challenges there is with grazing any kind of crop residue, as distinct from grazing a cover crop, is that when you're grazing a residue, and particularly with corn, the cows are pretty adept at finding that which is the most nutritious first. So as Mike pointed out, they're going to eat the bit that they really want to go along and eat first, and it's only when that's actually gone will they then go and eat something that's not that particularly nutritious. So it's really important that when you start out and you put your animals into, first of all, you should really go along and actually set out the area that these animals are going to graze in. And then it's really important to go along and just take a walk through and make sure that there aren't any sort of areas where corn may have spilt or that kind of thing. And that can be, because you can accidentally end up in a situation where animals could accidentally get acidosis from sort of gorging on a pile of corn that was accidentally dumped there. So it is beneficial to go along and take the time just to walk through, find out where those pieces are, and if you can gather it up, you can gather it up. If you can't, just go along and spread it out, so that at least when the animals do go along and start grazing, you're not in a scenario where you run the risk of any type of acidosis. The other thing, and Mike actually mentioned it there, it is corn stalks and residues of that type of nature don't tend to be very high in protein. So, and sometimes you may need to give a protein supplementation. Usually with dry cows, and it really comes down to, so I know in Mike's case, you've both a spring calving herd and you've got an fall calving herd. It's really important that, if the cows are in very early pregnancy, or early to mid pregnancy, then their protein requirements are not all that particularly high, and therefore you may not have to go along and give any kind of protein supplementation. But as they get later on in pregnancy, it would be important then to go along to provide some kind of a protein supplementation. And that could be just be in the very simple form of something like, say, corn distillers or something like that.
Okay.
The
There's another follow-up question on that theme.
Okay.
Do you know where someone could find example or typical feed analysis for standing cover crops and also for grazing cover crops to help them with formulating supplements and minerals?
Well, we'd have to go along and talk to either one of some of the feed companies, the nutritionists at some of the feed companies, and that certainly would, from an OMAFRA perspective, be a question for our feed and forage specialist.
Oh, so you're deferring it back to me. I mean, I would say particularly if it's your residues are going to be more consistent, at least through the fall, than cover crops because they're not growing. So you may get changes in mineral content as that leaches out over the winter, but they're going to be more stable than a growing cover crop. So my suggestion would be take a forage sample before you start grazing. And if it's a growing cover crop and you're on there for a long time, you might want to take another one partway through. And by a long time, I mean more than like a couple of months. So there are several labs in Ontario that offer forage testing, and they can help tell you, how to get a good representative sample and about shipping and that kind of thing. So that's probably the most accurate way. And then working with your feed company or nutritionist to get that supplementation balanced and right.
And I would just add to that, Christine, just keep a real close eye on your body conditions. And you'll always have some cows in the herd that will do great on pine cones and sticks, and other ones that can have really good feed and be really unthrifty. So we find that we'll sort our herds. So the groups that are outside on the corn stalks, if there's one or two that are getting a bit thin, we'll pop those out and put those into a group where they have a little better access to better feed. And that seems to balance things out as well.
Okay. The next question is for John. So if someone was looking for resources to help figure out some cost of production stuff to try to better understand that part of this whole cover crop grazing thing, what kinds of resources does OMAFRA have that might help them with that cost of production stuff?
We do have, now it's not a cover crop budget, but we do have our online, we've got cost production budgeting tools, so Excel based budgeting tools that can help you put together some of the cost of production, and there is a hay one there that you can then sort of modify to a cover crop scenario if you want to use the Excel based tools. And there's also a cost of production budgeting fact sheet that we have that talks about sort of the process of putting a cost of production together. So those are the two main things that we have on for helping you put together your cost of production budgeting.
Okay, thanks, John. I'm just writing myself a note to make sure to ask for that to link in the description of the video when we post the recording. That way people can find those if they're interested in some of that as well.
Yep, sure.
Are there particular genetics in cattle or sheep that are better suited to grazing outside all year long?
So I guess my base herd is red and black Angus for the mama cows, and then we put Simmental bulls on them. So we find the Angus are just a little easier keeping on corn stalks, etc. Having said that, we do have a bunch of Charolais, etc., that seem to survive and do quite well on this system as well. And that's just kind of over the years picking and choosing the ones that aren't working, head up the river, and ones that are working stay.
Yeah, I might just add that there are some genetic differences between cattle, and certainly their capacity to survive outdoors is more down at the individual animal level than any kind of breed level, because as Mike just mentioned there, you can have Charolais that do quite well and have no issues whatsoever and at -30, and you can have Highland cattle with long hair that would struggle when it gets down to those kind of temperatures. So it's more to do with making sure that your animals, and in Mike's scenario, because his cows are out all year round, so you get this gradual acclimatization to the environment that the animals are in. So as the weather gets cooler, cattle genetically will go along and lay down more fat, and they will lay down they'll put on a bit more hair, and that is basically how they go along and keep themselves warm. Cattle really don't suffer in conditions where you get even if conditions are really very, very cold, provided the animals stay dry. And that's the really most important. That's why it's really important when Mike talks about using windbreaks. It's really important that we have windbreaks, because obviously in still air, animals at -30 don't, it's of no concern whatsoever. However, if you're in a wind, then the wind effect means that the kind of thermal levels that they kind of can operate at, this thermal neutral zone essentially is lower, to use a kind of a fancy term. So the other bit then about that is it's really important to try and keep your animals dry. So cold, wet conditions are worse than really cold, dry conditions. So that's where the role of having a windbreak comes in. There's some place where when the weather is wet, that animals can actually go and stand beside, if they are outdoors, stand beside, say, a line of trees, or in Mike's case, say, a line of bales or something like that. There's no ways in which they can get themselves out of the prevailing wind and out of the prevailing rain. That's really what you're trying to go along and or in terms of their ability to go along and withstand the cold, there really is no breed issue there whatsoever.
Yeah, and
Also,
really what's
you know,
keeping them warm is the ability to fluff their coat out. So if it's too windy, the wind is blowing that warm air away from their bodies.
Yeah.
And if it's wet, they have a hard time fluffing their coat up to catch that air and keep themselves warm. And yeah, wet weather around the freezing mark is always a problem, is a comment we just got.
we'll also supply bedded areas for them to lay down too. So that's where that soybean straw we bale up comes really handy. Put that in spots for them to lay down where it's dry.
Yeah, and I mean, if someone was in the position where they were just starting out and they were buying in livestock, or they were expanding a herd or flock and buying in livestock, I mean, there's advice that you should look to buy from someone whose production system is similar to what you're doing, because then those animals are already set up to have a better chance to thrive. So things to consider, but is one breed better than another? Probably not. It's more how they're raised and what they're accustomed to. Also, for anyone who's interested, John has put links to a couple of the cost of production tools that he mentioned in the chat. So if you're interested in those, you can check out those links. Mike, what kind of manure spreader are you using? And is that manure solid or liquid?
So both.
Okay.
So we and I guess I should quantify our liquid manure. There's a bit of barnyard runoff. Most of it's carrot juice. So carrot juice and sweet corn silage juice, and that's about the same value as good hog manure. So it's fairly potent stuff. Our solid spreader, we use a Hagedorn with the vertical beaters.
Okay. Some other questions from earlier. Are you grazing? I think you kind of mentioned this. You've kind of scaled back from the really complex cover crop mixtures and are focusing on cereal rye, but are you grazing anything besides your corn stover and your cereal rye as far as annuals go?
This year we won't, but we've gone almost, I shouldn't say that. We do use some oats. I find to get a little better fall growth with some oats. Mm-hmm. So we will, but they do freeze off. So if I use a mixture of oats and rye, that gives me kind of the best of both worlds. And it kind of depends where I have a window to plant it. So if we get sweet corn harvested early, then I can utilize some oats in the mixture. Otherwise, I've gone almost exclusively to rye this past year.
Okay. How do you provide water to your cattle when they're out grazing in those fields? And do you have an idea of what the costs are associated with that?
So we don't run water lines or water bowls. So the cows will come up to the yard area. So we'll have feed bunks along the laneway that we can supplement feed to, and they'll walk up to the water areas along those laneways. So in a 200-acre field, they may have to walk the better part of half a mile or 3/4 of a mile to come for water. We find that most times in the wintertime, if there's a bit of snow or some meltwater, they don't come up for the water hardly at all. So they do have water available. They don't always utilize it.
Okay.
Part
Sorry,
of,
I asked some of these already.
I'll just add one more thing.
Yeah.
The reason we like them to walk so far for water is then they're well exercised, so that by the time calving comes in the spring, these cows are in good shape physically because they've had to walk for water and they've had to walk a fair number of miles every day. And that helps keep them in good shape, which makes calving a whole lot easier.
So if you think back to when you started grazing cover crops, first of all, when did you start grazing cover crops, and what was it that really made you think, yeah, I want to stick with this, this is working?
So we started in, so I guess in 2004, we started in the cow-calf operation. So we started grazing cow-calves on fields probably that first summer, late summer. And the first thing we did was after the wheat was harvested, we planted oats and we grazed oat stubble. And we grazed the oats that were on the wheat stubble. And that's where we started. And we've just been experimenting ever since and expanding till now. We're 100% of our land plus our neighbor's land is planted in cover crops for grazing.
Okay. And how do you estimate how many grazing days you have when you're about to turn cattle out into a field?
So it depends. Using John's word, it depends. I guess we monitor the cattle fairly closely. So as we're running out of feed, we're supplementing as we need to. We tried rotational grazing for a while, and we found that the cost of putting up fence and that didn't really justify it for winter cover crop grazing, because basically, if you think about it, what you have in the field is what you have in the field. It's not going to change. It's not like a summer pasture where you can manipulate the growth of the grass, etc. And even in the springtime when the rye is taking off, we had rye and barley side by side, and we didn't cross fence it, and the cows would go and eat barley for a while, and then they would go back and eat rye for a while. And they seemed to just go wherever they felt the day to be. And so we don't rotational graze at all. So I guess long story short, we monitor the cattle and monitor what's left in the field, and supplement in the really cold weather. We'll supplement some extra feed if we need to. But most of the time we can get enough grazing to get us through the winter without a lot of trouble.
All right, thanks, Mike. James, you're muted.
So we've just come up to 8:30. So I would like to take this opportunity to have a big thank you to Mike for your presentation today. It was very well done, and equally to John. Thank you for your presentation tonight. And I'd like to thank Christine for all your help in collating and collecting all the questions that were asked tonight. And I want to also have a shout out to the backroom team that helped to go along and to bring this all together. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Bethany Story, to Andrew Barry, Jake Monroe, and to Tom Lewis from Ontario Sheep Farmers. So as I say, that brings us to the end of tonight's session, and it brings us to the end of our 3 webinar series on grazing cover crops. I hope you'd had the opportunity to get some information that you're going to find useful on your own production systems. As I say, Christine and I and John are always available to go along if you have any questions on cover crops, whether that be on the production side, whether that be on the crop side or on the economic side. So don't be afraid to go along and to reach out. This is something that we're very keen to go along and to encourage producers to be involved in, whether you be a livestock producer or a crop producer. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to everybody, and have a very good night.